All right, so we're back here to answer questions. So I've got a barrage of questions. A lot of them were similar. So I'm going to go through some examples of the questions, and then if there are any that I missed, please let me know, or any other questions that you have, let me know. All right, so first to start out with, because I just got a question on email about this. These may not make so much sense in an order because I'm just answering the questions. So if anything's not clear, please let us know and we'll clarify it. Someone just asked me about the vaccines, whether what the adjuvants are in the Johnson and Johnson and in the mRNA vaccines as well. They don't have any adjuvants to my knowledge. I think that's one of the advantages of these kinds of vaccines, is that adjuvants potentially have been causing problems with other types of vaccines. Some of them, particularly aluminum, is one of the things that are being questioned as to whether that can cause problems. And none of these vaccines, to my knowledge, has any aluminum in it. Okay, so there were a lot of questions. I'm going to save this one, I think, until a little bit later. There were a lot of questions about which vaccine I would choose. Can you get it up a little bit?
Yeah.
As to which vaccine I would choose if I were to get vaccinated. And so that one took me a while, because I actually had to spend yesterday going through and creating a spreadsheet comparing all the different FDA FDA applications that they gave, so I could get some details to make what I would consider to be a rational decision on which vaccine. So I will talk about that later. So I'll start with the first question I'll start with here is someone said that they're hearing people say that COVID isn't really that risky, and they wanted to know how I feel about that. Okay, so risk is going to be a very difficult thing to talk about, because what do we mean when we're saying it's not risky? So obviously there have been a lot of deaths, and so it's been pretty risky for a lot of people, but this particular virus is stratified very, very severely according to age, for example. So we have, I have this, one of the more recent graphs. This one was done, I just printed this out so I can reference it. It came from The Economist, this particular one, but I've seen the actual original data, and The Economist just put it together fairly well. So this is a relatively accurate representation. And what you can see here, actually you probably can't because it's because it's black and white and it would be difficult for you to see. But what happens is up to about age 35, there really is, the risk is so minute. So just to give you an idea, there was some Nobel laureate was one of the co-authors on this particular paper, and it was published, I forget the exact journal, but I can get you guys citations if you need. But basically they looked at what the IFR was. So first you want to compare, of course, the fatality rates to something like the flu. But it turns out that the flu, they don't really have good fatality rates because they're all estimates and nobody kept real track of it. I know it sounds weird, but that's actually what happens. So we can't really compare it to the flu, unfortunately, very easily. So what they did is that they compared it to the risk of, for example, dying in a car accident, in an automobile accident. So in the United States, there's a certain risk that everyone has annualized for dying in a car accident. And so it turns out that if you're under 35 years old, your risk of dying of COVID, if you get it, is a quarter of the risk that you have of dying in a car accident in any given year. So that means children's risk of dying of COVID is incredibly low, much lower than the normal risks that all of us are satisfied with to take, to drive to work, to drive to the beach, to do whatever we do. And so when we're talking about risk for children, it's incredibly low. And those under 35. So also the teenagers partying at spring break, they're going to probably, spread COVID around to each other, but they're also very unlikely that many of them will die from that. However, when we start getting into people who are at 65 years old and over, then the risk of death becomes a lot more significant. And so, what we can see from this, this data that I have here, you have, and this, some of you may be surprised about it, but by the time that you are, let's say, 70 years old, if you're a man and you are 70 years old, your risk of dying of COVID is about 5%. So 95% chance that you'll make it if you get COVID if you're 70 years old. If you're a woman, the chance is 98%, 97.5% if you're 70 years old. So, when you start looking at risk in that way, in a percentage way, it doesn't sound like it's all that incredibly risky. Now, if you look at percentages and you expand that by how many people are being infected, then it becomes a lot of people, even though the percentage is small. So even if you talk about, only 1% of people dying, let's say, but you expand that out to millions of people, it still becomes a significant number of people, even though the risk individually may not be, that high or may not sound that high. So I hope that answers your question as to why people can disagree on how risky the disease is. Now, in my personal opinion, for people over 65 years old, it starts posing as a more significant risk. And in that particular population, vaccination seems to be a very logical way to mitigate that risk, because the vaccines are going to have risks, as we may be talking about a little bit here, and many of them are unknown risks. So there are known risks, there are unknown risks from the vaccines, there are risks from COVID. So over 65, it's definitely logical that may be worth taking the risk. Now, for children, for people under 35, let's say under 35 is not all children, but under 35, then that analysis is pretty different, right? Because if a child has a quarter of the risk of dying of COVID as they would from the risk of driving, just being driven around in a car, then taking those unknown risks doesn't really, to me, make any sense whatsoever. And a lot of scientists and physicians now are questioning, with an IFR, what they call an infection fatality rate so low for children, why are we doing vaccine trials on them right now? And so we may get into that, because some of the other questions were things like, people feeling pressured because they're feeling that people are telling them that if they don't get vaccinated, they're being selfish. And so we'll get into some of those kinds of things, and things for people to consider. And also, I want to say that I don't feel that I am the end all be all of answers of things, but all I can promise you is I'm giving you my actual opinions, and that my opinions are well informed. There obviously people can disagree with them, but that's where I'm coming from. Okay, so that's how I feel about people and risk. Let's see what the next question was. So everyone is telling us the vaccine is safe and effective, but I don't see how it can be safe when we only have a few months that the vaccine has even been licensed. Okay, well, that's kind of a minefield because we don't really know the answers to either of those questions. So again, over 65, it seems logical to consider vaccinating, and under 35, it's kind of tough to justify the risk. But in between, it gets kind of murky. So if we want to look at, because the way the studies were designed and the types of things that happened in the studies is maybe we'll get into later if we have time, it's really questionable because, for example, there were no deaths when they did the Moderna and Pfizer trials, there were no deaths in the placebo group either. So you can say that the vaccine was 100% protective against death if you want, which is what they market it as. But you can also say the placebo was 100% protective against death because no one in those two trials, died. In the Johnson & Johnson trial, there were a lot more people who died in the placebo group. A lot more. There were, I believe it was 7, I have the numbers over there, I believe 7 people died in the placebo group and nobody died in the vaccine group in the Johnson & Johnson trial. So Johnson & Johnson actually was the only vaccine that showed that it seemed to prevent some deaths. Now, when you look at that in a statistical analysis, And I won't get into the statistical details, but it showed no statistical difference. So that could have been that could have been by chance that happened, although, it is more suggestive. So when I may be hinting at which one I'm more leaning towards in terms of the vaccines if I were to get vaccinated. But we'll go over some more of those details. So anyway, in terms of efficacy, the Pfizer and Moderna, they were not. They did not encounter the variants. So we have absolutely no idea how effective those vaccines are, because now what's beginning to circulate are going to be very soon, if not already, mostly variants. However, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was tested with variants around, and it turns out that all of the deaths, 100% of the deaths in the Johnson & Johnson trial, which were all in people who received the placebo, happened in South Africa. And so the South African variant would appear, if we're just going to sort of, get what we can out of those data, it would appear the South African variant is going to be the one to really be more concerned about. And again, so we have no idea how effective any of those are, but we can have an idea that perhaps the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is effective against death, even though not statistically, but seeing 7 deaths versus 0 deaths, you can make some inferences about that for that one. So that's the difference in terms of effectiveness. Now, in terms of safety, again, we have no idea for any of them. Short-term safety, we have some ideas. When I was looking at what people were dying from when they were not considered to have died of COVID, because there were deaths in all of the trials in people in both groups, but someone was standing there saying, you're a COVID death and you're not. And who knows what that person's biases may have been. Things that were cardiovascular were not considered to be part of COVID, but we know COVID can cause cardiovascular symptoms. So, why maybe the vaccine would cause cardiovascular symptoms, but they decided not to, attribute that to the vaccine or whatever. So then the next thing that we can do is we can look at VAERS, right? VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Events Recording System, right? So that means if an adverse event happens, what you're supposed to do is file something to this CDC sort of data collection place so that they can try to see patterns. So it's a great idea to have VAERS. The problem is most people either A, don't know about it, or B, when things happen, they say, well, it's not the vaccine, so we're not going to report it to VAERS. But VAERS does not tell you that something is caused by the vaccine. I want to be very clear about this. What it does tell you is that something was in proximity to the vaccine that happened. So it may or may not. And things that we think are not, that had nothing to do with the vaccine may very well have to do with the vaccine. And we won't know that until we see enough data. So people should be reporting a lot more than they are. And estimates are that only less, either 1% or less of the adverse events are being reported to VAERS. Now, what does VAERS say about the various vaccines? All right, so the last death count that was, in proximity to the vaccines, according to VAERS, were about 1,700. So 1,700 deaths that happened, in relative proximity, or that kicked off a cascade that started right around the vaccine. And over 38,000 adverse events were reported to VAERS, meaning it was serious enough for them to report. Now, some of them are reporting I got a sore arm or something like that, but many of them are more serious than that. So let's see. All right, and I did stratify them, but I don't know where I put the data because I don't have all that data in my head. There were some differences between right. They're in my spreadsheet that I made. So I'll go over that later. Some of the differences in VAERS reports between the different vaccines and which ones had the lowest amounts of reports according to VAERS. So just to let you know, it's not necessarily the vaccines, when you say safe, it's all relative, okay? So people saying safe, you're going to want to say, well, safe compared to what? Because definitely the vaccine causes side effects. Definitely there are serious adverse events that are associated with the vaccine. If they're saying anaphylaxis is safe, or, getting some severe adverse event is safe as long as you're not dying, okay. But again, we have 1,700 deaths that have been reported in proximity to it. So you decide. To me, if you're over 65 years old, then you have a very real a real concern if you get COVID of dying. So that's a risk that maybe relative to that, the vaccine is safe, even if we don't have long-term data at all. But yet, if you're a child or you're under 35, it may not make so much sense. The word safe relative to your risks may have a different analysis there. All right. Next was, let me see here. Okay. Oh yeah. So the next question was whether I got many questions about whether it was safe for fertility or pregnancy. Okay, so this is another area where scientists and the media are really, I would say, misleading people, I think. So I hear all kinds of scientists and physicians stating emphatically that it's safe during pregnancy and safe for fertility. And some people don't want to flat out lie. And so they say that there's no evidence to suggest that it could possibly cause fertility problems. And that, so far as we know now, it seems safe during pregnancy. And then you see a lot of people saying that they believe in science and therefore they believe that therefore the vaccine is safe. And I want to be very clear to everybody that science is not a belief system. In fact, science is supposed to be the opposite of a belief system. Science is a process. It's a process of having a hypothesis and then examining that. And so belief has no place in science, whatsoever. Again, they're acting more like it's a religion, like, I guess Scientology is already taken, but Scienceology, it would be something like that, okay? So you can't really necessarily take that. Now, there are studies, so, when you look up the different lines of how a vaccine may cause problems in reproduction, and again, I'm not saying it does because I have no idea. I have no idea if it does, and I have no idea if it doesn't. What I do know is that there are logical lines of reasoning as to how it could negatively impact fertility and could negatively impact pregnancy, okay? So now, before I forget about this, in terms of pregnancy, you have to keep in mind, when they're going to do the studies on pregnancy, which they're doing, they're going to tell you the outcomes relative to that pregnancy, right? So, is the mother okay? Is the baby, a preterm baby? What's their APGAR score? Like, what's their grade when they come out? Are they all okay? Do they have their fingers and toes and all that? And that's pretty much at most what you're going to see. What you're not going to see is what happens developmentally. And we don't know. These things could cause, predispositions to autoimmune diseases. They could cause predispositions to neurological problems. For example, look at autism, right? They think that autism starts, and I'm not suggesting that the vaccine causes autism. I'm just using this as an example. Autism is something that they believe, that scientists currently believe, that starts in the womb, that something in the womb is causing that. But you don't know that a child has autism for a few years after they're born. And so we're not going to have any idea for many years whether this is safe to use during pregnancy. And I want people to understand this, that you are taking a risk by getting the vaccine during pregnancy. It's an unknown risk, okay? Yes, you're also taking a risk if you get COVID while you're pregnant. And, again, the data is not like it is for people who are 65 and older, where it's a slam dunk. And it's not like it is for people 35 and under, or under 35, where it seems like, gee, there's no risk. You're in a gray zone there. So, but you should definitely realize that you are not going to get the whole story when they come out and tell you that it's safe and effective, okay? It could be effective, but the safety is going to take years to determine. And this is the same with children, by the way. You can't determine long-term safety in children as to what's going to happen to them developmentally, what's going to happen to their reproductive systems. You won't know this for a while. So anyway, back to reproduction. So in reproduction, there are two basic ways that the vaccine could cause problems, at least that I can think of off the top of my head. One way is from the vaccine itself, and the other way is from a process that the vaccine can stimulate. And that process would be this process of your body creating antibodies to the spike protein. And then the question is whether those antibodies can cross, what they call cross-react. That means the antibodies can bind to the spike protein, but you know how they say, well, those antibodies, they'll bind to the spike, but if it mutates, it can still kind of bind to the other variants, and so we're not so worried about, you know, the variants. The vaccine will still work, at least the antibodies to the vaccine, I think, will still work. Well, this is kind of true, and, you know, we won't get into the perils of what can happen. Not only could it bind to the other variants, but it could cause an ineffective immune response to the variants that makes things worse, but we're not going to get into that. That's just a theoretical possibility. But it is this idea that an antibody can bind to the spike protein, but can also bind to something else. And that something else could be your own tissue, your own body, molecules in your own body. So someone did a study, I think it was Vojdani and Karazian for people who, and I think I talked about this a little bit on the last one, but the fertility question keeps coming up, so I'm going to answer it again. So in this study, they basically took monoclonal antibodies to the spike protein, and they said, okay, well, what in human tissue can it cross-react with? So it cross-reacted with a number of things in the human tissue, including mitochondria, which are the portions of the cells that help you produce energy, and including things like TPO, which is thyroid peroxidase, which is, you know, part of your thyroid function. So things like that could have massive effects on fertility. So in you know, many of you may not know, but, you know, for example, a heart cell, mitochondria, that powers the heart cells, right? They have like 200 or 300 mitochondria per cell. Okay, so that's what it takes to keep your heart running. But for an egg cell, your reproductive cell, an oocyte, they need like 200 to 300,000 per cell. So mitochondria are very important for reproduction. And if you're having cross reactions against mitochondria, not only could it lead to a chronic fatigue in a more, you know, gross sense, but in a more subtle sense, it could lead to underfunction of a reproductive system. Now, if that can happen with a vaccine, of course it could happen as well when you get infected, right? If you get an actual infection and your body creates antibodies to that actual infection, it could also cross-react, and this is very true. But there is also a difference, because the vaccine, it turns out, the antibodies that are stimulated artificially by the vaccine last much longer, is what it seems so far, than the natural antibodies that are produced from a natural infection. Now, of course, everyone in the vaccine world thinks that that's a good thing, and it is if you're trying to protect yourself against, you know, the virus, but it's not a good thing if it's cross-reacting. And so, as I mentioned last time, it seems like there's some kind of a, you know, your body has some kind of wisdom that, ooh, these antibodies, we need them right away just to make sure we don't die or get killed or whatever. But long term, the cost benefit isn't good to keep them around, because they're cross-reacting or they're doing things that we don't want them to do. And so it allows the antibodies to drop down and then relies more on T-cell immunity. We're not going to get into too many details on that. Unless you want to, then you can ask me questions. But that part gets really, you know, technical from the T-cell immunity. But so that's the idea of what can happen from the standpoint of the natural expectations of vaccines and how that could affect fertility. The second portion that it can affect fertility is from the vaccine technology itself. Now, there are many things about the vaccine technology that we don't really know yet what's going to happen, because they're new technologies. And, you know, I'll throw in one other question that I had, which was, you know, well, isn't the Johnson & Johnson technology, since that's been around with the Ebola vaccine, that's been around longer and is more tested and so forth and so on. And so the answer is yes, that's true with Johnson & Johnson. Again, I'm starting to give away my where I'm going with this, but that technology has been around a little longer, but the Ebola vaccine was never approved and it still hasn't been widely used. So that technology is still, you know, relatively untested, even though it has a longer history than the mRNA vaccines really do in terms of it still being used and still in ongoing trials. So at any rate, the technology that's being used for all three of them involves nanoparticles. Okay, so nanotechnology is really amazing, and I'm sure they're going to figure out eventually ways to cure cancer and all kinds of other diseases using this technology. However, there's also literature, there's a decent amount of literature to show that nanoparticles can be reproductive toxins. So there's like an entire review that I had read that discussed all the different ways that nanoparticles are causing reproductive issues. So that's another potential way that reproduction can be negatively impacted by the vaccines. So when someone tells you that, there's no, it doesn't cause reproductive harm. There's no evidence of it. It's like, sure, if you don't look and you don't think about it and you don't research it, then yeah, there's no evidence, But if you do, then you see that there is evidence and there are ways. And so it's just a question of, where people's interests are and if they're just, really trying to find out these answers or they're just trying to get you to take the vaccine. So clearly, if they're asking too many questions, it's going to slow down the vaccine delivery. And I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be good or bad. We're going to see if it turns out that the vaccines really work and they really help, then it's better in some ways. It would save more lives that people just had to go and get the vaccine after all, than it would otherwise. But we'll see how that turns out. Okay, so did I answer that question enough? Was that one good for everyone? Because that was one I got multiple.
Yeah, I think that's good enough.
Okay.
I mean, I think the point is a lot of people are getting harassed by their OBGYNs and stuff like that. So I think people just need to have a solid, answer.
Okay, great. Hopefully that was it. Okay, so then the other questions we have, where is the next one? What can we do to strengthen, okay, I answered the adjuvant question. Do you have any recommendations for preventing SARS-CoV-2 from infiltrating the nervous system? Okay, so there's been some discussion about, so we think, scientists think that SARS-CoV-2 is able to invade the central nervous system. They don't know exactly how it's getting there. At first they thought that anosmia, that when you lose your sense of smell, that was because the virus was invading the nerves and the sinuses, and then they could enter the brain directly through the nerves. And then they found that the nerves themselves don't have ACE2 receptors there, and so that wasn't the pathway. And then other people found that actually that was a pathway, but they were getting through it in a little different way. So there's some concern that through the sinuses is one way that it can get into the nervous system. It can also get into the nervous system in many other places. And once the virus gets into the nervous system, it's a relatively what they call an immune privileged site, meaning that the immune system has to be very careful around it. There are different types of immune system, whatever you call them, molecules, or not molecules, but like white blood cells and things like that, that are involved. So like in the nervous system, we have more of the microglia, what we call, which are macrophages, like these big eaters, part of your innate immune system, that protects you when things start getting into the nervous system. So I guess my answer to this is to protect you against SARS-CoV-2 from infiltrating your nervous system, you have to have a strong innate immune system. And in this particular case of the nervous system, you're looking largely at microglial cells, the macrophages of the nervous system, let's say. And this also creates a lot of problems, because once it gets into the nervous system, you're not going to necessarily have the same symptoms that you're going to have when it's going through the rest of your body. So your body will mount, and a lot of people don't realize this, but when COVID comes around, when you get COVID is more the response of your body to the virus than the symptoms being caused by the virus itself. Therefore, if you're infected with this virus and it goes straight into your nervous system, you may be what they call asymptomatic. You may not have symptoms because your body doesn't want to start bombing your nervous system, because that'll be instant death, right? Or that'll be paralysis. So you have to, once a virus can get to the nervous system, your immune system has to be very careful with how it takes care of it, right? So that's something to think about also, about, well, what happens when you get an asymptomatic infection? That virus is still in your body, it can still go around, and even when you're vaccinated, right? We know now vaccines don't cause sterilizing immunity, what they call. So sterilizing immunity means that the virus comes in and then your antibodies grab it and stop it. They can't escape. They're what they call neutralizing antibodies. And you do not get infected, and you cannot transmit the infection onto anyone else. That doesn't happen with these vaccines. And if it does happen, it's at a certain percentage. It's not true sterilizing immunity. So when you get vaccinated and you encounter the virus, you definitely can get infected, and you can pass it along. What we hope is that it allows you to take care of the infection quicker. And so then you have less of a chance of passing it along and so forth. That's the idea or the hope. But, we actually don't know, what's going to happen with that. So again, asymptomatic infection can mean either that your immune system is very strong and able to keep it at bay, or it can mean that it got through your initial borders and went straight into your nervous system, and your body is not willing to bomb your nervous system just in order to get to the virus, and it's going to take its chances with the virus running around through your nervous system. So to protect against that, again, you want to keep your innate immunity up, essentially. What else here? Oh, yeah. So then the other thing about that is, so how do we prevent it from getting into your brain, for example, into the central nervous system? So not just keeping your innate immunity up, but there is something else called a blood-brain barrier, called the BBB, right? And the blood-brain barrier essentially makes it so it's very difficult for molecules to get only certain ones. They're very special transporters to get certain molecules into your brain, and that protects your brain from a bunch of garbage that goes around in your body from getting into your brain and getting deposited there, because you got a bunch of fat tissue in there, and you could accumulate a lot of garbage, and it can cause a lot of havoc in your body, obviously. So what can weaken the blood-brain barrier? Well, there are a number of things, but one of the big ones that we have in our society now are basically, microwave radiation, different types of electromagnetic fields. And so you need to be, or you may want to consider being careful with that. That means it can come from your cell phones, it can come from your routers, it can come from your cordless phones, your Bluetooth devices, all of that. So for sure, you don't want to be wearing those, Bluetooth earbuds, because those are putting microwave radiation right into your brain, right into your head. If anything's weakening a blood-brain barrier, I think that would be the most likely thing, because it's so close. Because the intensity of of radiation drops off very quickly with distance. So if you're going to talk on your phone, you don't want to have it up against your ear. You want to keep it out here and use speakerphone. Or if you have your router, you're going to want to shut that off at night. Have it, and these will automatically do that. You can program your router to automatically turn off at 10 o'clock or whenever you go to bed, and then automatically turn back on at 7. So you're just not being pounded with radio frequencies at night when you don't need to be. And that can weaken your blood-brain barrier. So that is one good way to help prevent a weakening of your blood-brain barrier.
Sleep.
What's that? Oh, also getting enough sleep is immensely important. I think I might talk about it later, but melatonin is something that can definitely help reduce, it can help protect your nervous system from invasion, and so that's something that that you want to make sure that you do. And that's the other thing is, don't use a lot of blue spectrum lighting at night. That'll help preserve your melatonin. If you can't get away from it, then you can get those, rose-colored glasses. You can get those kind of things. Any orange or red glasses will filter out the blue light, and that should help you in terms of produce your own endogenous melatonin. Okay, next question. Oh, okay, I guess this person knew what the answer would be to the first question, so they said, what can we do to strengthen our innate immunity? Well, the biggest thing to strengthen your innate immunity is by not distracting your innate immunity with a bunch of basically garbage, a bunch of crap. So don't overburden it with a bad diet. Don't, make sure you get out in the sun, get vitamin D from the sun, because it's not just about vitamin D. It's not just about UVB. UVA can also improve your health and help with many things. So those are all, good. The fresh air is very important. And because somebody asked, I saw on Facebook earlier, somebody asked whether mold and all these other things can be involved in making you more susceptible, and the answer is of course, absolutely, because it can distract your immune system. It burns your immune system, and so you want to free that up. That's the most important thing and the easiest thing. You don't need to go buy things. You just need to have your lifestyle being more moderate. That includes exercise. You should exercise regularly but moderately. If you have too much strenuous exercise, that's going to reduce your immunity rather than improve it. And there's a lot of debate about this with the some of the PTs that are not just the researchers who are researching this, saying, well, it only showed a temporary drop in immunity and this and that. But from a Chinese medicine standpoint, and Chinese medicine has thousands of years of experience. So to me, I take that with very heavy weight as opposed to just a relative cross-sectional experience that we have in a lot of the Western studies of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But anyway, what they say is if you exercise to the point where you're tired afterwards, that's too much. Okay, so they say follow the Tao, which means just listen to your body, right? If you're exhausted after you exercise, that's too much. That's not going to be good for your immune system. If you have energy after you exercise, that's perfect. That's what you should have. You should feel good after exercising. That should be your gauge. Other things are, when you're eating, you can add in little things that help your immune system out. Things like the culinary herbs, your thymes, your basils, your mints, these types of things, some garlic, some ginger. All of these can be beneficial because they'll help knock out other bugs, which frees up your innate immune system to be doing other things. Then you can actively try to upregulate your interferon production and all that kind of thing, and you can use some of the medicinal mushrooms like the reishi mushrooms and so forth. A bunch of Chinese herbs can help with that. But really, I think the best thing for most people, and those are in like our formulas. Like if you are a patient of ours and we've been giving you, prevention formulas, these are things that increase your innate immunity to help block the virus from getting into your nervous system and so forth if you encounter the virus. So that's the ideas behind that. Okay, next. Okay, I don't know if I want to answer that one. Let me see. Adjuvants, I answered that.
I answered that one too.
I answered that one too. All right, I guess I am going to answer. How much time do I have?
Hold on. There are a couple questions about vaccine and how that would affect people with autoimmune diseases, and does J&J use nanoparticles?
Okay, J&J does use nanoparticles, so the answer is yes for all of them. How much time do we have?
20 minutes.
Okay, so how it will affect immunity on autoimmune disease, it's weird. Okay, so when you're talking about some of these things, autoimmune diseases or cancer or things like that, things aren't necessarily logical all the time. So you'd think, well, vaccines can stimulate more autoimmunity, and I definitely have my trepidations with vaccines and autoimmunity when it comes to adjuvant-based vaccines. So these are the ones with aluminum that artificially just whack your immune system out. But these aren't really artificially whacking your immune system out. I mean, it's artificial in a way, but they're doing it in a more, I hate to say it, but it's true, they're doing it in a more natural way. They're getting your cells to present the way that they would normally kind of present something to the immune system, and then the immune system is doing its kind of normal thing. Now, it's not quite, because normally you're going to have a different innate immune response. And so this is going to get this gets a little complicated, but your body, the innate immune system, which is your first line of defense, and the adaptive immune system, which are your antibodies and your second line of defense, they have a lot of communication, and they're learning off of each other in many ways. So even the innate immune system they're finding now has memory cells. So when you're getting vaccinated with these new technologies, even though it's a little more natural, and it's not actually training the innate immune system the way natural infection is. So there are going to be differences, but for the purposes of autoimmunity, I'm not convinced that these vaccines will cause more problems with autoimmunity. I'm not sure. So that one, that's all I can tell you for now.
What about in terms of
we'll see.
Its efficacy?
Efficacy for what?
Well, like if the vaccines would be as efficacious, just because if you're on an immunosuppressant.
Oh. So if you're on an immunosuppressant, I'll have to look, but it shouldn't really affect the antibody production, too much. Maybe you get some lower antibodies or something like that. You should still get them. I'm sure it depends which immune drugs you're on, so it's going to be difficult for me to answer that. But immunosuppression is affecting, somebody's saying cell reactivity is a worry with autoimmunity. Okay, Hillary, if you could just get a little bit more on that, so I know more about what you mean with that, then I'll respond to that. So with that, the biggest problem is your innate immune system is going to be compromised when you have when you're on immunosuppressants. And so you're going to want to be careful, vaccinated or not vaccinated, because keep in mind, once the virus gets in and you're asymptomatically infected, which is what happens when you're vaccinated or you have, mild symptoms, then what's going on is that the virus itself can still move around. It's still replicating. It's just hopefully the immune system kicks up and gets in there and the T cells start shutting things off. But in order for the T cells to work, that means by definition the cells are infected. T cells are not antibodies, right? It's different. And the antibodies are largely not neutralizing. I mean, they're binding to some, the variants are to some of the variants, but it's not really good. It's not impressive. And this is why when they tell you that the vaccines work for the variants, it pains me to hear that, because Moderna, and Pfizer, they're saying, the vaccines work on the variants, but Moderna just started their trial on a Gen 2 vaccine that's going to address the variants. And if the vaccines really worked for the variants, then they wouldn't have to make the Gen 2 yet. They would wait until they saw things that the vaccine didn't work for. At any rate, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for the autoimmunity. It's going to be one of those wait and see. But with cancer, one of the interesting things, there was a case of lymphoma, I think it was lymphoma, I may be wrong, it may have been leukemia, some blood cancer. And there was a resolution of the cancer after they got SARS-CoV-2. They got sick with COVID, and that kicked their immune system up, which then eliminated the cancer. So sometimes these things don't work the way that you think they are. And this is why I'm reticent to make recommendations when I don't have a lot of data in terms of, yes, go for it. I want to see what's actually going to happen, longer term. Okay, what was that? Okay, so then the question I didn't necessarily want to get to, I guess I'll get to real quick, which was, where is it? Where was that one? Oh, I guess I'm... Oh, that was the one about the pressure. Where is that one? That question. I'm sorry, I have to find this question. Okay, here. The question was, I'm being told I need to vaccinate and that my kids should get vaccinated as soon as it's approved to protect other people. It's a lot of pressure. Am I being selfish if I don't get myself or my kids vaccinated? The reason I don't want to answer this is because it's very difficult to discuss this in a way that's not going to make me sound like a moron. I guess the way to think about it is that it's going to depend on what you mean by selfish. And selfish is a difficult word because the person asking you to take unknown risks for you and your child is really being selfish because they're not considering that something could happen to you or to your child, right? And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that who are you really protecting, right? So the people that are most vulnerable, and this isn't a judgment on people because I strongly feel that people should live life sort of in a way that is meaningful to them. But most of the people who are vulnerable have done things, and the reason they're vulnerable, they've done things with their own lifestyle choices. Maybe they drank a lot of alcohol and they probably enjoyed it, or maybe they're addicted, or maybe they're overeating, or they develop diabetes and obesity. So their choices. And some people have no choice. They just got a disease, they got a virus or something, and then they ended up with diabetes. I'm not saying this is everything, but a lot of people in this country make poor choices, and that's why they become more susceptible. And so what they're doing is they're asking you to, make sacrifices or to risk your own life in some ways, or your own well-being and your children, to, help prevent things that they potentially brought on themselves. So that becomes a very, difficult thing. It's almost like, and by the way, most of these people, they're getting vaccinated not because they're doing it for everyone else, they're doing it for themselves. And the reason this is because the masks come right off after the vaccination and they're not careful anymore. That's nothing about themselves because the data doesn't show that vaccination protects you from transmitting it to somebody else. As a matter of fact, the data shows that you still get infected with vaccines. So, when you see somebody doing that and criticizing you, you know that they're being selfish and doing the vaccine mostly for themselves, right? Otherwise, they would be just as cautious as they were before, but now they're more protected with the vaccine. And again, I don't want to come across and say that, oh, nobody's doing it for other people and all that. There are people like that, for sure. And I don't think people are idiots who get vaccinated. I think, you can be very intelligent and make very good risk assessments and still decide that it's better for you to get vaccinated. So I don't want to leave anyone with that impression. What's that?
The one on the left side.
Okay, what about permanent disability and long COVID in younger populations who likely won't die? When does vaccine risk become less than the risk of the disabling post-infection changes? I mean, that's a great question. I hope I read it out okay. But the answer to that is we have no idea. But from a Chinese medicine standpoint, let me tell you, long COVID, this is not something new. There's long flu, long cold, long everything. This is thousands of years this has been going on. Chinese medicine describes it. The oldest books in Chinese medicine describe how pathogens come into your body and become chronic diseases. They say hundreds of diseases come from wind, what they say. So wind means the things that travel through the air, like viruses, or it could be bacteria, or so forth and so on. So and we've seen this in, over 20 years in practice. We've treated this all through the years. So this idea of long COVID is not something new at all. Many of our cases of chronic fatigue that we treat, or cases of myocarditis, or cases of all kinds of other things, you trace it back, it comes after they were infected with something, with a cold or with whatever it may be. So at any rate, the long COVID idea isn't new, and it's not something that's specific to COVID, even though they call it long COVID. And so I don't think that that's necessarily something, I think the amount of long COVID that we're seeing in kids, we're not seeing a whole lot of it. There's the Miss C and all that, and Miss A, for adults and for children. And so we have this microscope on COVID. So everything about COVID we see that have actually been the case for other viruses, but we just haven't been looking so carefully. I mean, I had compiled a list of things from influenza, right? So you may not know this, but here are some of the things that influenza causes.
And we've seen this.
And we've seen all this, okay? So here's a list of some of the things that influenza causes: myocarditis, ischemic heart disease, strokes, encephalitis, encephalopathies, Guillain-Barré, narcolepsy, Parkinson's syndrome, rhabdomyolysis, optic neuritis, acute kidney injury, hepatic complications, diabetes, thromboembolic diseases, and it goes on and on and on. Would you ever think that the flu or a common cold could cause all those things? No, because nobody really talked about all of that stuff. But they're doing that with COVID, and that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at all these kinds of risk assessments. It doesn't look like massive amounts of children are getting, long COVID and so forth. Are they? Yes, we all have a microscope on the kids that are. But we need to wait and see, what the burden is on that. And even then, Chinese medicine, we've been treating this type of thing for many years. So most of these things are treatable, at least in our experience. Now, I'm not saying they're all easy to treat or they're all, curable. But I think I'm less concerned about that personally, because I think that it's something that's been around. So then the other thing, I was finishing about the getting vaccinated. How much time do we have?
Just like 10 minutes.
Okay, so can you pull up the chart that I made, because I am going to want to go through with the vaccines and why. So then the last thing about that, so I had also wanted to mention, there is this ethical dilemma, again, about people, when you don't get vaccinated, then it's hurting other people. So there's this, if you go on NPR, there's a great thing about the ethical dilemmas you have and all these different things where they have, they're talking about cars that are, automated cars, and it has to decide whether it's going to crash into X or kill Y, does it kill the passenger to save 4 lives if there are 4 pedestrians, or does the car, once the cars are automated and you have artificial intelligence making these decisions of which lives do you sacrifice to save another life, and would people buy cars that would sacrifice their lives to save some, pedestrians? So there are these very interesting, ethical questions. But, you can ask yourself, if somebody swims out into the ocean and it's a, really choppy, thing, and they can't swim well or whatever, they can swim well and they end up starting to lose it and drowning. Do you need to jump in to save them? Is it your ethical obligation to jump in and save them, even though you don't know what's going to happen to you? You may be a strong swimmer, but maybe you don't know what's going to happen when you get into that ocean. It's risking your own life. Is that your responsibility, to do that? Or the fact that that person made that decision, does that play some role in it? And it becomes even more difficult because COVID is so much more deadly. So again, if we're looking at the actual statistics of, the percentage of people that die and at what age is a huge factor. But if you look at women, let's say women who are 84 years old and older, okay, they have a 10% chance of dying. Okay, so 90% chance of survival even for an 84-year-old woman if she gets COVID. Okay, for a man at 84, it's a bit higher. It's like 18% or something like that. So, when we're talking about, we're not talking about also a disease that's killing, a third of the people who it's infecting. It is killing a third of people if they're, let's say, it hits a third once you get to about 80 some years old and you have chronic liver disease, which is the worst of the comorbidities in terms of death. So if your liver's toast, then, that's it. So these are some of the issues that I think it doesn't make it such a slam dunk that you should be sacrificing your children or yourself for necessarily for other people, given the circumstances in this. But these are all ethical issues that everybody has to resolve for themselves, and I don't think that it's such an easy answer on that. Okay, so I'm going to get into the thing that I've had the most people ask me for, which is which vaccine would I get if I were to get them? And so to answer this, I had to go in and reanalyze everything because, I don't memorize, everything that was in every study. And so just to give you like the lowdown, the answer for me as of right now is Johnson & Johnson would be the one that I would get. Now, of course, they say that it's, Johnson & Johnson is much less effective and blah, 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 blah. But, you have to take into consideration a few things. And really, number one, we know that Johnson & Johnson has the longest track record really in terms of study because it's been developed with the Ebola vaccine and so forth. And, number two, when you take a look at, for example, where is this here? The ratios of adverse events to death. So I looked in VAERS. Now, there haven't been very many Johnson & Johnson vaccines being given, so that ratio is going to be a little misleading. But looking at that, that's only one of many different reasons why Johnson & Johnson seems to come out ahead on this one. So the VAERS deaths in the vaccine group versus the adverse events. So we have 0.42%. 0.42% is the ratio. So the ratio, or 0.42 is the ratio for the deaths to adverse events. So how many of the adverse events resulted in death? And for the Pfizer one, it's 3.7. So that means there are a lot more deaths per adverse event, at least in these reportings. And then for Moderna, it was 5.5. So even more than Pfizer. So it was between Pfizer and...
5.05.
What's that? 5.05. Sorry. So for Pfizer, it was it was better than Moderna in terms of that. But yet for efficacy, right? The efficacy for the Johnson & Johnson was touted as being relatively low, and there are differences actually in the efficacy calculations. But let's say some say it's 87%, some say it's 60-some%, but doesn't matter. What matters is there were no hospitalizations and no deaths. So even if you got COVID, it was mild to moderate. Okay, so the efficacy of Johnson & Johnson is good enough in terms of if you're looking for the vaccine to protect you, right? And then the efficacy for the Moderna and Pfizer were 95% and all that, but they didn't test it against any of the variants that are running around, whereas the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was tested against many of the variants that are running around, including the most deadly one, which is the South African one. And that's like what we were saying. In the South African one, variant, there were 7 deaths in the placebo group and no deaths in the vaccine group. And so to me, and we don't know what's going to happen with the Moderna or with the Pfizer vaccine because it hasn't been field tested at all with these variants. So to me, those 95% are just like, pick whatever number you want, and especially because they had no deaths in those. Now, keep in mind, the COVID deaths in the placebo group for both the Pfizer and the Moderna were 0. There were no COVID deaths in the placebo group. meaning no deaths. So when you have 19,000 people basically in a trial, or 15,000 people in a trial, and you have no deaths at all, something's wrong with either the group that you selected, or you just ran it in a place that didn't have COVID. And in fact, when you look at the number of COVID cases in the placebo group, which gives you an idea of how many people were actually infected. Where did I put those? I don't remember exactly the number. I had them somewhere, but there was something like, just a few, what was it? Placebo cases. It was like 185 cases. So in the Moderna, for example. So they only ran into the virus and showed COVID in 185 people out of those 15,000 people. So it has not been, the Pfizer and Moderna have not been field tested. Then when you look at vaccinated deaths versus placebo deaths, when you're talking about not necessarily COVID deaths, but any kind of death, because who knows, like I said, they may not have counted a death that was due to the vaccine or due to COVID that just didn't show the symptoms the same way. We see in the Moderna, there were 4 deaths in the vaccinated group and 4 deaths in the placebo group. In the Pfizer, there were 2 deaths in the vaccinated group and 4 deaths in the placebo group. And in the J&J, there were 2 deaths in the vaccinated and 12 deaths in the placebo. Now, when you have so many more deaths in the placebo group, it suggests that the Johnson & Johnson, so what you would do, this may be getting overly complicated, but you basically multiply out the number of placebo deaths in Pfizer to match Johnson & Johnson and see what your numerator is, which would be 6 vaccinated deaths in the Pfizer group, and then it would be 12 vaccinated deaths in the Moderna group, and only 2 vaccinated deaths in Johnson & Johnson. So when you start manipulating the data and trying to compare them so that they're closer, Johnson & Johnson becomes really a clear winner, at least with the data we have so far. This may change with Israel data coming out, this may change with whatever, but as of right now, it's definitely a clear winner out of these 3 for Johnson & Johnson. Not to mention, you only need to get one shot right now, and so a lot of the severe side effects that happen in Pfizer and Moderna happen after the second shot. So, and again, I want to let me see what else. And I want to make it clear that I'm not against the vaccine. I just want to make sure people know what the actual factors are that you use to do a risk-benefit analysis for yourself. I think anyone between 35 and up, that's a really, murky risk-benefit analysis that everyone should do individually. Under 35, I think we should really be careful because the risks, unless it's showing that everybody's getting long COVID, you have 60% or some enormous percent of the population, getting some severe something happening. Unless something like that changes, I think under 35, doesn't make that much sense to me. All right, any questions left? I know we have no time. It's probably going to end in a second, but if you want, you can also write down questions and we'll try to answer them later.
Yeah, if you just post on the feed, then I think that it should keep a record of it, and so we'll be able to respond to that.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Oh, someone's saying Johnson & Johnson is not really available at this point. Well, I mean, it will soon. I know they bought a bunch of J&J, so it should be coming out sometime soon. And then by the time you're protected, remember, it's going to be a month before you would be, even if you got it today, it would be a month before you would be protected, or longer, maybe a month and a couple weeks, whatever, before you're fully protected from Pfizer and Moderna vaccines anyways. So.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone.